A millionaire catches his maid teaching Braille to his blind son without his permission. The new employee, defying all the rules, decided to bring light into the child's dark world through touch and Braille reading. The reaction of the millionaire in the mansion shocked everyone. Watch until the end to see what he did. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The waves crashed against the rocky shore below the majestic Peterson mansion, their rhythmic sound the only music that young Thomas had known for the past 3 years. The 10-year-old boy sat in his specially designed chair by the window, his fingers tracing patterns on the glass as he listened to the ocean. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt more like a pristine prison than a home, with its strict schedules and rotating cast of specialists who seemed to speak more about him than to him. "Young master, it's time for your morning exercises," announced Dr. Harrison, one of the many professionals his father had hired to assist with his daily routine. Thomas sighed quietly but stood up obediently, his hands automatically reaching for the familiar guide rail that had been installed along every wall of the mansion. The morning proceeded like every other, carefully timed physical therapy sessions, followed by academic lessons that felt mechanical and detached. Thomas could sense his father's presence occasionally, the subtle cologne that announced his arrival, the sharp tap of his Italian leather shoes on the marble floors, but direct. Interaction was rare. Alexander Peterson believed in structure above all else, convinced that a rigid routine would somehow compensate for his son's blindness. In the kitchen, Mrs. Sullivan, the head housekeeper who had been with the family for over 15 years, watched Thomas's session with concern. She had been more than just a housekeeper. She was the only one who remembered how Thomas used to be, a vibrant, laughing child who loved adventure stories and climbing trees. Now he was a shadow of that boy, trapped in a world of schedules and safety protocols. "Mr. Peterson," Mrs. Sullivan called out as she spotted her employer heading to his home office. "Might I have a word?" Alexander Peterson paused, his tall frame turning slightly. "What is it, Mrs. Sullivan? I have a conference call in 10 minutes. "Sir, I've been meaning to speak with you. I need to leave my position," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "My sister has fallen ill and she needs full-time care. I've found someone excellent to replace me, someone I trust completely." Alexander's expression remained impassive, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his leather portfolio. Mrs. Sullivan had been a constant in Thomas's life, one of the few connections to the time before the accident that had taken both his sight and his mother. "How soon?" 2 weeks, sir. The woman I'm recommending, Claire Bennett, she's exceptional. She has all the necessary qualifications, impeccable references." "Have HR run the usual background checks," Alexander interrupted, already turning away. "Ensure she understands our protocols regarding Thomas. No deviation from his schedule, no unnecessary conversation. Structure is essential for his development." As Alexander strode away, Mrs. Sullivan watched him with a mixture of sadness and frustration. She hadn't mentioned Claire's most important qualification, her years of experience working with visually impaired children at the New Hope Center. She knew Alexander would likely reject her if he knew, given his insistence on keeping Thomas away from anything that might remind him of his condition. In his room, Thomas sat alone, his fingers running over the smooth surface of a photo frame. He kept hidden under his pillow. He couldn't see the image anymore, but he remembered it perfectly. Him, his mother, and his father at the beach, all smiling all together. His mother's laugh had been like sunshine, warm and bright. Now the mansion felt cold, despite the expensive heating system that maintained a perfect temperature year-round. Outside his window, storm clouds gathered over the ocean, their approach heralded by the changing rhythm of the waves. Thomas could feel the shift in the air pressure, a skill he had developed since losing his sight. A storm was coming, but not just the one brewing over the water. In her small apartment across town, Claire Bennett reviewed the employment contract from the Peterson household. Her fingers traced over the long list of rules and regulations, her mind already forming plans. She had seen too many children like Thomas, isolated, withdrawn, their potential locked away behind walls of overprotection and misunderstanding. She knew she was probably crossing a line by not disclosing her full background, but sometimes rules needed to be bent to let the light in. As the day drew to a close, Thomas lay in his bed, listening to the storm that had finally arrived. Lightning flickered behind his unseeing eyes, and thunder rolled across the water. In his father's study, Alexander Peterson stared at a photograph on his desk, the same one Thomas kept hidden under his pillow, his expression unreadable as he worked late into the night, trying to build a fortress of success around the pain he couldn't face. Neither father nor son knew that their carefully ordered world was about to change. In 2 weeks, Claire Bennett would walk through their door, carrying with her the seeds of transformation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, healing, and the true meaning of seeing clearly. Claire Bennett arrived at the Peterson mansion on a bright Monday morning, her simple black dress and practical shoes a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Mrs. Sullivan greeted her at the service entrance, quickly ushering her inside for what would be their brief overlap period before the older woman's departure. "Remember what we discussed," Mrs. Sullivan whispered as they walked through the gleaming kitchen. "Mr. Peterson has cameras everywhere, and he reviews the footage regularly. Stay within the guidelines, at least at first." Her knowing look spoke volumes about what she hoped Claire would eventually accomplish. The mansion was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and strategic lighting, but to Claire it felt sterile. As Mrs. Sullivan led her through the daily routine, Claire noticed how every aspect of the household revolved around Thomas's schedule, yet paradoxically seemed designed to minimize actual interaction with the boy. "Young Master Thomas has his breakfast at precisely 7:30, Mrs. Sullivan explained, showing Claire the meticulously labeled kitchen system. "Everything must be placed exactly as shown in these diagrams. Mr. Peterson believes consistency is crucial for Thomas's independence." Claire nodded, but her trained eye noticed what was missing. No tactile markers that Thomas could identify himself. No opportunities for him to learn through exploration. The system was designed to manage his blindness, not help him adapt to it. Later that morning, Claire caught her first glimpse of Thomas during his daily lessons. He sat perfectly straight in his chair, answering his tutor's questions in monotone, his fingers still on the desk before him. Claire's heart ached, recognizing the signs of a child who had learned to make himself small, to exist without imposing. "Mrs. Bennett," Alexander Peterson's voice cut through her observations. She turned to find him studying her with cool assessment. "I trust Mrs. Sullivan has explained our protocols." "Yes, Mr. Peterson. Everything is very clear," Claire replied, maintaining a professional demeanor while noting how he positioned himself, always slightly turned away from the room where his son sat learning. "Good. Thomas's routine is essential to his development. We don't coddle him here, Mrs. Bennett. Sentimentality won't help him succeed in a world that won't make allowances for his condition." Claire saw Mrs. Sullivan wince slightly at his words, but she kept her expression neutral. "I understand completely. Sir, structure and consistency are very important." She left unspoken her knowledge that love and understanding were equally vital. As the day progressed, Claire watched Thomas navigate his carefully controlled world. She noticed how he would sometimes turn his head toward the windows, seeking the warmth of the sun on his face, a natural instinct that had somehow survived the rigid routine. During his designated free time, while he sat in his window seat, she observed how his fingers would occasionally drift toward the glass, as if reaching for something beyond his prescribed boundaries. In the privacy of the staff quarters, Mrs. Sullivan shared more details about the household's history. "Before the accident, this place was different," she murmured, showing Claire an old photograph album she kept hidden in her room. There was laughter, music. Mrs. Peterson, Catherine, she filled this house with life. Thomas was always running, playing, climbing things he shouldn't. Mr. Peterson was different too. He smiled then. Claire studied a photograph of a younger Alexander Peterson, his arms around his wife and son, all three caught mid-laugh on what appeared to be a sailing trip. The contrast between that image and the man she'd met today was striking. As evening approached, Claire was organizing supplies in the kitchen when she overheard Thomas's occupational therapist reporting to his father. "He's plateauing, Mr. Peterson. The current methods aren't producing the results we'd hoped for." Perhaps if we considered some alternative approaches. The program was thoroughly researched. Alexander cut in. We'll increase the intensity of the current exercises. Thomas needs to learn to overcome obstacles, not avoid them. Claire busied herself with the dishes, her mind already forming plans. In her bag, carefully hidden, she carried a copy of Treasure Island in Braille. The same adventure story Mrs. Sullivan had mentioned was Thomas's favorite before the accident. It would be a risk, definitely against protocols, but as she listened to the waves crashing against the cliffs below the mansion, she knew some risks were worth taking. That night, after the household had settled into its evening routine, Claire stood in her new room unpacking her modest belongings. Through the walls, she could hear the faint sound of Thomas's voice, asking his evening nurse if the stars were out tonight. The nurse's response was brief and dismissive, focused only on completing the bedtime checklist. Claire walked to her window, looking out at the same sky. The stars were indeed out, scattered across the dark velvet of the night like diamonds. She made a silent promise to herself and to Thomas that soon he would have ways to see the beauty of the world again, not through his eyes, but through his heart, his mind, and his hands. A week into her new position, Claire had memorized every detail of the mansion's rigid schedule. She observed how Thomas moved through his days like a perfectly programmed automaton, each hour marked by a different specialist or lesson. But she also noticed the small moments when his true self leaked through. A slight tilt of his head when he heard birds outside, the way his fingers sometimes drummed silently against his leg when he thought no one was watching. During breakfast service, Claire deliberately placed a glass of orange juice slightly out of its designated spot. Thomas reached for it automatically, his hand finding empty air where the glass should have been. Instead of correcting her mistake as protocol demanded, she waited. "The juice isn't where it should be," Thomas stated flatly, his hand hovering uncertainly over the table. "You're right," Claire replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Would you like to find it?" Thomas's brow furrowed in confusion at this deviation from routine. Usually any misplaced item was immediately corrected with apologies and fuss. After a moment's hesitation, his hand began to move carefully across the table's surface. "It's a little to your left," Claire offered when his fingers came close. The brief smile that flickered across his face when he successfully grasped the glass was like a ray of sunshine breaking through clouds. Alexander Peterson watched this interaction, on his office monitors, his jaw tightening. He reached for his phone to call the head of household staff, but stopped, his hand hovering over the receiver as he observed his son take a sip from the glass with something almost approaching satisfaction. Later that morning, during Thomas's piano lesson, one of the few activities that seemed to truly engage him, Claire quietly organized the library. She discovered a shelf of children's books, dusty from disuse, including several copies of Treasure Island. Taking advantage of a moment alone, she slipped the Braille version she'd brought into the same spot as the original, making it look like it had always been there. The afternoon brought one of Thomas's least favorite activities, his session with Dr. Matthews, the child psychologist who visited twice weekly. Claire could hear the doctor's patronizing voice through the study door as she organized linens in the adjacent room. "Now, Thomas, let's talk about your feelings today. Are you still having those dreams about the beach?" "No," Thomas replied, though Claire had overheard him mentioning waves in his sleep to his evening nurse just the night before. "That's excellent progress. Avoidance of traumatic memories is a natural healing process. Now about your father. Are you still feeling distant from him?" "I feel fine," Thomas answered in that same flat tone he used whenever adults tried to probe too deeply. That evening, after Thomas's last therapy session, Claire was surprised to find Alexander Peterson waiting for her in the kitchen. He stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the sunset, looking more like a statue than a father. "Mrs. Bennet," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I noticed some irregularities in your morning service today." Claire met his gaze steadily. "The orange juice, sir?" "Among other things, the protocols exist for a reason. Thomas needs consistency and structure to develop independence." "With all due respect, Mr. Peterson," Claire replied, choosing her words carefully. Independence often grows from learning to handle small inconsistencies. Finding his own juice glass this morning made Thomas more confident, not less. Alexander's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. "You have experience with this?" "I have observed that children are often more capable than we imagine, sir. Sometimes they just need the chance to try." Before Alexander could respond, a crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Both adults rushed toward Thomas's room, finding him standing amid the shards of a fallen water pitcher, his face a mask of anxiety. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, reverting to that small, careful voice. "I was trying to get it myself instead of waiting for evening service. I miscalculated the distance." Claire watched Alexander's face, seeing the battle between his instinct to take control and something else, perhaps a memory of the boy who once climbed trees and ran through these halls without fear. "It's just a pitcher, Thomas," Alexander said finally, his voice gruff but not angry. "Are you hurt?" "No, father." "Good. Mrs. Bennet will help you clean this up and get ready for bed." He turned to leave, then paused. Perhaps we could review the placement of your bedside items tomorrow. Make them more accessible." After Alexander left, Claire helped Thomas carefully step away from the broken glass. As she guided him to a chair, she felt a slight tremor in his hand. "You know," she said conversationally as she began cleaning up the mess, "when I was young, I broke my mother's favorite teapot trying to make her breakfast in bed. Sometimes the things we break lead to better things being built." Thomas turned his face toward her voice, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw genuine curiosity in his expression. "What better things?" "Well, in my case, my mother taught me how to make tea properly, and it became our special time together every morning. Sometimes we need to break out of old patterns to find new ways forward." As she helped Thomas get ready for bed, Claire noticed him running his fingers along the edges of his bedside table, as if mapping its boundaries in his mind. She smiled, recognizing the first signs of awakening curiosity. The boy who loved adventure stories was still in there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. Mrs. Sullivan's departure day arrived with the kind of pristine autumn morning that had become typical at the Peterson mansion. As she said her goodbyes, her eyes lingered on Thomas, who stood perfectly still by the grand staircase, his face carefully composed despite the trembling in his lower lip. "You be good, young master," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And remember what I told you about the stories. They're always there even when we can't see them." After Mrs. Sullivan left, Claire noticed Thomas spending more time than usual in his window seat, his fingers tracing patterns on the glass. She recognized the signs of grief, so carefully contained within the mansion's strict protocols. That afternoon, during his designated free time, she decided to take a calculated risk. "Thomas," she said, approaching his seat quietly, "I was organizing the library earlier and found something interesting. Would you like to see it?" His head tilted slightly, curiosity warring with the ingrained habit of maintaining emotional distance. "What is it?" Claire placed the Braille copy of Treasure Island in his hands. Thomas's fingers automatically moved across the cover, then froze as they encountered the raised dots. "This is different," he said carefully, his training evident in how he avoided showing too much interest. "It's called Braille," Claire explained, keeping her voice casual. "It's another way of reading stories. Would you like to learn how it works?" Thomas's fingers continued to explore the cover, his expression gradually shifting from careful neutrality to cautious wonder. Does my father know about this?" "The book has always been in the library," Claire replied, technically telling the truth. "And learning new skills is part of your development program, isn't it?" A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips, the first real smile Claire had seen from him. For the next hour, she guided his fingers over the basic alphabet, explaining how the dots formed letters and words. Thomas absorbed everything with an intensity that belied his usual passive demeanor. Later that evening, Alexander Peterson sat in his study, reviewing the day's security footage. He paused on the image of Claire and Thomas in the library. His son's face animated in a way he hadn't seen in years. His finger hovered over the intercom button to summon Claire for questioning, but something stopped him. Perhaps the memory of another boy, long ago, who had also found joy in stories. The next morning, during Thomas's regular music lesson, his piano teacher noticed a change. "Your rhythm is different today, Thomas," Mr. Rodriguez commented. "More alive. Have you been practicing differently?" Thomas's fingers continued to move across the keys, playing a piece by Mozart with newfound energy. "I've been reading," he said simply, then added quickly, "in my head, I mean, remembering stories." Claire, dusting nearby, caught the subtle smile on Thomas's face as his fingers danced across the piano keys, so similar to how they had moved across the Braille dots the day before. She was beginning to see how his natural intelligence and curiosity had been merely dormant, not lost. That afternoon, while Thomas was with his physical therapist, Claire was surprised to find Alexander in the library, standing before the shelf where she had placed the Braille book. "Mrs. Bennet," he said without turning, "I noticed some unusual activities in yesterday's footage." Claire's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, sir. Thomas showed interest in learning something new, and I thought it aligned with your goals for his development." Alexander picked up the Braille copy of Treasure Island, his fingers running over the dots, much as his sons had done. "This was Catherine's favorite book to read to him," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She did all the voices, pirates, sailors, Jim Hawkins. She made them all come alive." For a moment, Claire saw past the stern businessman to the husband and father, who had also lost something precious in the accident. "Thomas remembered the story," she offered gently. His fingers found the words just like they find the piano, keys. Alexander replaced the book carefully, his movements precise. "My mother," he said suddenly, "she always said that weakness shouldn't be indulged, that challenges should be overcome through discipline and structure." He paused, then added, "She said the same thing about my brother." Before Claire could respond to this unexpected revelation, they heard Thomas's voice from the hallway, returning from his therapy session. Alexander straightened, his moment of vulnerability passing like a cloud over the sun. "Ensure that any additional learning materials don't interfere with his regular schedule," he said briskly, moving toward the door. But he paused at the threshold, adding quietly, "And Mrs. Bennet, thank you for organizing the library so thoroughly." That night, after the household had settled into its evening routine, Claire passed by Thomas's room and heard a soft sound she'd never heard before, humming. The tune was from one of his piano pieces, but the rhythm was different, more playful. Through the slightly open door, she could see him sitting cross-legged on his bed, fingers moving across pages of the Braille book in his lap. In his study, Alexander Peterson sat at his desk, staring at an old photograph album he kept locked in his bottom drawer. His fingers traced the edge of a particular photo. Two young boys at a piano, one standing, one seated, both smiling. With a sudden, decisive movement, he picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Mother," he said when the call connected, "we need to talk about some changes I'm considering for Thomas's schedule." The arrival of Victoria Peterson at the mansion cast a shadow over the subtle changes that had been blooming within its walls. Alexander's mother swept through the front door like a winter wind, her designer suit as crisp as her expression. Thomas, sensing the shift in atmosphere, immediately straightened his posture and smoothed his features into careful neutrality. "Grandmother," he greeted her with perfect politeness, his hands clasped formally in front of him. "Thomas," Victoria acknowledged, her eyes critically assessing her grandson. "I trust you're keeping up with your studies." Without waiting for an answer, she turned to Alexander. "The car service will bring my bag shortly. I'll be staying for a few weeks to oversee some changes." Claire, watching from the doorway of the kitchen, noticed how Alexander's shoulders tensed at his mother's words. He looked less like the powerful CEO and more like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "Mother, I don't think—" Alexander began, but Victoria cut him off with a wave of her manicured hand. "Clearly, your call about changing Thomas's schedule was concerning enough that I felt I needed to intervene personally. We can't have him falling behind due to distractions. That evening, during dinner service, Claire observed the family dynamic with growing concern. Victoria dominated the conversation, speaking about Thomas as if he weren't present, outlining her plans for intensifying his therapy sessions and academic programs. "We simply must maintain standards," Victoria declared, butter knife clicking precisely against her plate. "The Peterson name carries certain expectations. Your brother—" She stopped abruptly, an unusual slip in her careful control. "What brother?" Thomas asked, his head tilting with interest at this new information. "Never mind that," Victoria said, sharply. "Focus on your meal. Proper posture, Thomas. Shoulders back." Later that night, as Claire was preparing Thomas's room for bed, she found him sitting unusually still in his window seat. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly. "Did you know I had an uncle?" Thomas's question came out barely above a whisper. "I only just learned about him myself," Claire replied honestly. "Would you like to talk about it?" Thomas's fingers twisted in his lap, a nervous gesture she hadn't seen before. "Grandmother never makes mistakes like that. She never mentions things she doesn't want discussed." He paused, then added, "Like mother." The next morning, Victoria intercepted Claire as she was preparing breakfast. "Mrs. Bennet," she said, her voice glacial, "I've reviewed the household protocols. There seem to have been some irregularities in their implementation." "I've followed all essential guidelines, Mrs. Peterson," Claire responded calmly, continuing to arrange Thomas's breakfast setting. "Indeed, and I suppose teaching Braille was in those guidelines, or perhaps encouraging emotional attachment was part of your job description." Before Claire could respond, they heard Alexander's voice from the doorway. "Mother, I approved the Braille instruction. It's a practical skill that could prove useful for Thomas's independence." Victoria turned to her son, eyes narrowing. "Independence like your brother's independence? Look how well that turned out, a common tradesman touching other people's pianos for a living. Is that what you want for Thomas?" A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Claire noticed Alexander's hands clenching at his sides, saw the way his jaw worked as he struggled with words that had perhaps been buried for decades. "James," he said finally, his voice rough. "His name is James, Mother, and he didn't leave. You sent him away." "I protected this family's reputation," Victoria snapped. "A blind child attending a regular school, learning trade skills instead of business management? It would have been a scandal. I made the necessary decisions that you seem unwilling to make for Thomas." "Mrs. Peterson," Claire interjected quietly, "Thomas has been making remarkable progress with his music since starting Braille. His piano teacher mentioned—" "Ah, yes, the piano," Victoria interrupted with a cold laugh. "Another sentimental indulgence. Catherine always did encourage too much artistic expression. Look where that led. Her reckless driving that day, taking Thomas to that beachside concert—" "Enough!" Alexander's voice cracked like thunder in the kitchen. "You will not speak of Catherine that way. Not ever." In the silence that followed, they heard a small sound from the doorway. Thomas stood there, his face pale but composed, his hands gripping the doorframe with white-knuckled intensity. "The accident wasn't Mother's fault," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "She swerved to avoid another car. I remember everything about that day." Victoria moved toward Thomas, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "Darling, you were so young and trauma can play tricks on memory. Now let's get you to your morning lessons. I've arranged for an additional mathematics tutor." "No." The word was quiet but firm. Thomas's unseeing eyes were fixed somewhere, past his grandmother's shoulder, toward where his father stood. "I want to keep learning Braille, and I want to know about Uncle James." Claire watched Alexander's face as he looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. She saw the moment something shifted, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. "Yes," Alexander said softly, then with more firmness, "Yes, Thomas. I think it's time we talked about a lot of things." Victoria Peterson's presence in the mansion had the unexpected effect of catalyzing change rather than preventing it. The morning after the kitchen confrontation, Alexander cancelled Thomas's appointments for the day, something unprecedented in the household's rigid schedule. "Mrs. Bennet," he called to Claire as she was organizing the morning tea service, "would you join us in the library and bring the Braille book, please?" In the library, Thomas sat in his favorite window seat while Alexander occupied the leather armchair across from him. Victoria had retreated to her guest suite, claiming a migraine, but her absence felt like a weight lifted from the room. "Your Uncle James," Alexander began, his voice uncertain but determined, "was 2 years younger than me. He was born with congenital blindness." "Like me?" Thomas asked, leaning forward slightly. "No, not exactly. Your condition came from the accident. James never had sight at all." Alexander paused, accepting the tea Claire offered him with a distracted nod. He loved music. Started playing piano when he was 4 years old. Mother hired the best teachers. Of course, but she wouldn't let him attend a school for the blind, said it would attract too much attention." As Alexander spoke, Claire quietly placed the Braille copy of Treasure Island in Thomas's lap. His fingers automatically found the raised dots, tracing them like an anchor as he listened to his father's story. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked when Alexander fell silent. "He left. Or rather, Mother sent him to a private facility when he was 16. Said it was for specialized education. But really, she just wanted him out of sight. I was in college by then, focused on business school, becoming what a Peterson was supposed to be. I let it happen." Thomas's fingers stilled on the book's cover. "Do you know where he is now?" "He became a piano tuner. One of the best in the country, actually. He has his own business in Boston. A family." Alexander's voice caught. "I haven't spoken to him in 20 years. Claire watched Thomas process this information, saw his hands return to exploring the Braille dots with renewed purpose. "Father," he said finally, "could we look for him?" Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window. For a long moment he stared out at the ocean, his silhouette rigid against the morning light. "I wouldn't know how to begin," he admitted finally. "Maybe," Claire suggested gently, "we could start with music. If he's a well-known piano tuner in Boston." "No." Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stood in the doorway, her migraine apparently forgotten. "I forbid it. Alexander, you're letting sentimentality cloud your judgment. Thomas needs structure, not family drama." But something had changed in Alexander. He turned from the window, and Claire saw in his face the same quiet determination she'd noticed in Thomas when he first touched the Braille book. "Mother," he said, his voice level but firm, "you don't forbid anything in my house, not anymore." Victoria drew herself up, her face pale with anger. "I see. And I suppose you'll let Thomas throw away his future like James did? Let him waste his potential on frivolous pursuits." "James didn't waste anything," Alexander replied. "He built a life, a successful one, despite our family's idea of what success should look like. And Thomas," he turned to his son, really seeing him, "Thomas will have every opportunity to find his own path." "Then you'll have to find it without me," Victoria announced, her voice cold. "I'll have my things packed within the hour. Don't expect me at the holiday gala this year. I couldn't bear to watch you destroy everything we've built." After she left, a strange peace settled over the library. Thomas sat very still, his fingers still resting on the Braille book. "Father?" he asked softly. Alexander crossed the room and for the first time in what seemed like years, sat beside his son. "Yes? Would you like to learn how to read this with me?" Thomas held up the book, his face hopeful. Claire quietly began to withdraw from the room, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Bennet, Claire, would you show us both how to begin?" As she sat down with father and son, showing them how to form letters with their fingers, Claire noticed something remarkable. Alexander's hands, usually so controlled and distant, shook slightly as they touched the raised dots. But when they found their first word together, adventure, both father and son smiled, and in that moment, they looked so much alike that Claire's heart caught in her throat. Outside the library window, the autumn sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the three of them as they began their own adventure. One that had nothing to do with buried treasure, but everything to do with discovering what had been lost and found again. The days following Victoria's departure brought subtle but significant changes to the Peterson mansion. Alexander began working from home more often, his laptop now frequently occupying a corner of the library, while Thomas practiced his Braille nearby. The rigid schedule that had governed their lives slowly became more flexible, adapting to their newfound shared interests rather than controlling them. Claire watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, particularly during their morning Braille sessions. Alexander proved to be a quick learner, his business-trained mind approaching the new language with methodical determination. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to blossom under his father's attention, his natural intelligence emerging from behind years of careful restraint. "Listen to this, Father," Thomas said one morning, his fingers flying over the raised dots with growing confidence. "The bar silver and the arms still lie, for all that I know, where Flint buried them." He paused, grinning. "It's just like solving a puzzle, isn't it?" Alexander looked up from his own practice text, his expression softening. "It is, though I suspect finding buried treasure is easier than mastering these dots." "Actually," Claire interjected gently, "Thomas is progressing remarkably fast. His spatial memory and sensitivity to texture are exceptional." The comment would have once been met with stiff formality, but now Alexander merely nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "Just like James was with music. Speaking of which," he hesitated, then continued, "I've had my assistant doing some research about piano tuners in Boston." Thomas's hands stilled on his book. "Did you find him?" "There's a James Peterson who owns a company called Perfect Pitch Piano Services. He's quite well known in classical music circles, apparently. The company's website has a contact form." "Have you written to him?" Thomas asked, barely containing his excitement. Alexander's fingers traced the Braille dots before him, a gesture that had become almost unconscious over the past few days. "Not yet. I'm not sure what to say after all these years." "Why not start with the truth?" Claire suggested. "Sometimes the simplest approach is the best one." Later that afternoon, during Thomas's piano lesson, Mr. Rodriguez noticed something different in his students' playing. "Your interpretation of this piece has changed," he observed. "There's more emotion in it now, more connection." Thomas's fingers continued moving over the keys as he replied, "I've been thinking about my uncle. He's a piano tuner and he plays too. I wonder if he knows this piece." Mr. Rodriguez exchanged a knowing look with Claire, who was arranging flowers nearby. "Music has a way of connecting people across any distance," he said. "It speaks its own language, just like your Braille books do." That evening, Alexander called Thomas and Claire into his study. The familiar scent of leather and wood polish was joined by something new, the salty breeze from the open window, previously always kept firmly closed. "I've written to James," Alexander announced without preamble. "I sent the email an hour ago." Thomas sat forward in his chair, his face alight with anticipation. "What did you say?" "I told him about you," Alexander replied softly. "About how you're learning Braille, about your piano playing. I told him about the accident, about your mother." His voice caught slightly. "And I apologized for not standing up to our mother, for letting him be sent away, for all the years of silence." Claire noticed how Alexander's hands were trembling slightly as he spoke. This man, who had built his life around control and structure, was finally letting himself be vulnerable. "I also told him something else," Alexander continued. "I'm making some changes to the Peterson Family Foundation. Instead of just focusing on business development, we're going to start a new initiative, funding music and arts programs for visually impaired children." Thomas's face broke into a radiant smile, reminding Claire of the photographs she'd seen of him before the accident. "Really? Can I help?" "Of course. In fact, I was hoping you'd be willing to learn more about how other visually impaired children are taught. There's a center in the city that Claire recommended." Claire startled at the mention of her name, especially since she hadn't actually made any such recommendation. Alexander met her surprised look with a knowing smile. "Mrs. Bennett," Claire Did you really think I wouldn't look into your background when you were hired? Your experience at the New Hope Center for Visually Impaired Children was quite impressive. A slight blush colored Claire's cheeks. I thought you might object if you knew. I would have then, Alexander admitted. But now I think it's exactly what we needed. He turned back to Thomas. What do you think about visiting the center, meeting other children who are learning the same things you are? Thomas's expression was a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Would you come with me? Of course, Alexander replied without hesitation. We'll go together, all of us. As if in response to the moment, a warm breeze swept through the study, carrying with it the distant sound of waves. Thomas tilted his head, listening. The ocean sounds different when the windows open, he observed. More real somehow. Everything feels more real lately, Alexander said quietly, and Claire saw him reach out and take his son's hand, a simple gesture that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Later that night, as Claire was doing her final rounds, she heard laughter coming from Thomas's room. Actual, genuine laughter. Peering in, she saw father and son sitting together on Thomas's bed, their fingers moving over Braille pages as they took turns reading dialogue in different voices, just as Catherine had once done. The response from James Peterson arrived 3 days later while Thomas was practicing a new piano piece. The gentle melody of Mozart filled the music room when Alexander burst in, his usual composed demeanor slightly disheveled. He wrote back, Alexander announced, his voice thick with emotion. James wrote back. Thomas's fingers stilled on the keys. What did he say? Claire, who had been turning pages for Thomas, watched as Alexander pulled up a chair beside the piano. His hands shook slightly as he held his phone, reminding her of Thomas's first tentative touches on the Braille books. He says he's thought about reaching out many times over the years, Alexander began reading. He has 2 children. We have a niece and nephew, Thomas. The older one is actually learning piano too. He paused, collecting himself. He says he'd like to meet us if we're willing to come to Boston. Thomas's fingers traced the piano keys without pressing them, a habit he'd developed when processing strong emotions. When can we go? Alexander looked at Claire, then back at his son. James suggested next weekend. He has a piano recital at his daughter Sarah's school, and he thought you might enjoy hearing her play. The joy that spread across Thomas's face was matched by the tentative hope in his father's eyes. Claire felt herself witnessing something precious, the rebuilding of a family long fractured by fear and prejudice. We'll need to prepare, Alexander continued, slipping back into his familiar planning mode. The flight to Boston, hotel arrangements. Claire, would you be willing to come with us? Thomas might feel more comfortable with you there. Of course, she replied, touched by how naturally they had become a team in supporting Thomas. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Thomas threw himself into practicing a particular Mozart piece that he learned his cousin was also studying. Alexander alternated between making travel arrangements and pacing nervously in his study, often pulling out old family albums that had been locked away for years. During one such evening, Claire found him staring at a photograph, his expression distant. Would you like some tea, Mr. Peterson? She offered. Alexander, please, he corrected absently. And yes, thank you. He held up the photograph, 2 young boys at a piano. This was taken the week before Mother sent him away. I was home from college for the weekend. James was playing Chopin, showing me how he could feel the music better than I could see it. Claire set down the tea tray. Thomas has that same sensitivity to music. Yes, Alexander smiled. Catherine always said he had his uncle's gift. Even before he trailed off, then added quietly, I've been so afraid of him getting hurt that I nearly hurt him myself, didn't I? Just like Mother did with James. But you changed, Claire reminded him gently. You're giving Thomas what he needs now, and maybe giving yourself what you need too. Alexander looked at her thoughtfully. You've been instrumental in that. Change, you know. Your patience, your understanding. It's been more than just professional expertise. Claire felt her cheeks warm at the sincerity in his voice. Thomas made it easy. He has such a beautiful spirit when he's allowed to show it. Like his mother, Alexander said softly, then cleared his throat. Claire, I've been thinking about the future, about making some permanent changes to how we live. Before he could continue, they heard Thomas calling from the music room. Father, Claire, come listen to this part. I think I finally got it right. They found Thomas beaming at the piano, his hands positioned confidently over the keys. As they listened to him play, Claire noticed how Alexander's hand brushed against hers, very slightly before he pulled away to applaud his son's performance. The next morning, as they prepared for their daily Braille lesson, Thomas asked an unexpected question. Claire, do you think Cousin Sarah would like to learn Braille too? We could read stories together even though we're far apart. That's a wonderful idea, Claire replied, touched by his thoughtfulness. Maybe you could be her teacher. Like, you're our teacher. Thomas's unseeing eyes turned toward her with uncanny accuracy. Father says you've taught us both more than just Braille. Claire felt emotion tightening her throat. Sometimes the best lessons aren't in any textbook, she managed. Like how to be brave? Thomas asked. Like Father writing to Uncle James? Exactly like that, she agreed, watching as Alexander entered the room, carrying their practice books and wearing the soft smile that had become increasingly frequent lately. As they settled into their lesson, Claire noticed how naturally they had fallen into a rhythm together, Thomas between them, all their hands moving over the raised dots, discovering words and stories and truth. Outside, the autumn, wind carried the sound of waves and distant seabirds, no longer kept at bay by closed windows and rigid rules. The mansion that had once felt like a museum of loss was slowly transforming into something else. A home where memories could be treasured without becoming prisons, where new stories could be written alongside the old ones, where love could grow in unexpected ways, like flowers pushing through cracks in carefully maintained walls. The morning of their departure for Boston dawned clear and crisp. Thomas sat in the back seat of the car between Claire and Alexander, his fingers moving restlessly over the travel bag in his lap, which contained his Braille books and sheet music. What if they don't like me? Thomas whispered to Claire as they approached the airport, voicing the fear that had kept him awake most of the night. They're going to love you, Claire assured him softly, just like your father and I do. Alexander's sharp intake of breath at her words made Claire realize what she'd said, but before she could backtrack, Thomas smiled and reached for both their hands. The moment passed in comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding. The airport presented its own challenges. Thomas had never flown since the accident, and the cacophony of sounds and voices initially overwhelmed him. But Alexander and Claire had prepared for this, creating a protective buffer around him without being overly restrictive. Listen to the patterns, Claire suggested as they waited at their gate. Each announcement has its own rhythm, just like your piano pieces. Thomas tilted his head, concentrating. You're right. And the luggage carts have different squeaks. Some high, some low. It's like an orchestra, isn't it? Alexander, who had been tense since they left the mansion, relaxed slightly at his son's enthusiasm. Your mother used to say something similar. She could find music in everything. The flight itself became an adventure rather than an ordeal. Thomas discovered that he could feel the subtle changes in altitude through pressure in his ears, and the gentle vibration of the engines became a kind of white noise that soothed his heightened senses. We're flying through clouds now, Claire described, continuing the practice they'd started of helping Thomas experience the world through words. They look like giant cotton balls scattered across a blue tablecloth. I remember clouds, Thomas said thoughtfully. They were always changing. Shapes. Mother used to play a game with me, finding pictures in them. He paused, then added, Do you think Uncle James remembers what clouds look like? Alexander, who had been pretending to work on his laptop, closed it gently. No, he was born without sight, but he used to tell me he could feel them, the way they changed the sunlight on his face, how they made the air feel different before rain. As they began their descent into Boston, Claire noticed Alexander's hands gripping the armrests tightly. She realized that this journey wasn't just challenging for Thomas. Alexander was facing his own fears and regrets, with every mile that brought them closer to his brother. The Boston air that greeted them was different from the familiar ocean breeze of home, crisper, filled with the scent of autumn leaves and urban energy. Thomas noticed immediately, his face turning curiously as they exited the airport. "It smells like history," he declared, making both adults smile. They had arranged to meet James and his family the next morning, giving themselves time to settle into their hotel and help Thomas adjust to the new environment. The hotel's suite Alexander had booked was spacious, with connecting rooms that allowed them to maintain their familiar dynamic while giving everyone private space. That evening, as they sat in the suite's living area, Thomas practiced the Mozart piece one last time on a digital piano the hotel had provided at Alexander's request. His playing was different here, more experimental, as if the change in location had freed something in his interpretation. "Sarah plays this part a little differently," James had mentioned in one of their email exchanges, attaching a recording of his daughter's practice session. They played it now, and Thomas's fingers moved along with his cousin's melody, creating a virtual duet across the city. "Do you think she's nervous about meeting us too?" Thomas asked during a break. "Probably," Claire answered honestly. "But sometimes the best friendships start with everyone being a little nervous together." Alexander, who had been standing by the window watching the city lights, turned suddenly. "I've been thinking," he said. His voice, carrying the tone that Claire had learned, meant he'd made an important decision. "About the mansion and our life." "There." Thomas's hands stilled on the piano keys. "What about it? It's very isolated, isn't it? Away from everything and everyone. Maybe..." He glanced at Claire before continuing. "Maybe it's time for a change. The new Hope Center you mentioned, Claire, it's here in Boston, isn't it?" Claire's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, about 20 minutes. From here, actually." "And James's piano service company is based here," Alexander continued. "There are excellent schools, cultural opportunities, and..." He took a deep breath. "Family." Thomas sat very still, processing this possibility. "But what about your work? The company?" "Companies can be run from anywhere these days," Alexander replied, "and some things are more important than maintaining a particular address." Later that night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Claire found Alexander still at the window, his reflection thoughtful in the glass. "That was a big suggestion you made," she said quietly. "Too big?" he asked, turning to face her. "I don't want to overwhelm him with too many changes at once." "I think," Claire said carefully, "that some changes open doors we didn't even know were closed." Alexander took a step toward her, then stopped, his expression conflicted. "Claire, A small sound from Thomas's room interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They found Thomas sitting up in bed, his hands moving restlessly over his blanket. "I can't sleep," he admitted. Could we practice some more Braille? All of us?" And so they spent the next hour sitting on Thomas's bed, reading together from Treasure Island, their shoulders touching comfortably as their fingers moved over the raised dots, discovering new treasures in the familiar story. Outside, the Boston night hummed with possibility, while inside, three people who had started as strangers continued their journey of becoming something more, something that felt remarkably like family. The morning of the recital brought with it a mix of autumn sunshine and nervous energy. Thomas sat at the breakfast table in their hotel suite, his toast untouched as his fingers practiced phantom piano keys on the tablecloth. "What time is it?" he asked for the third time in 10 minutes. "Still 2 hours until we meet them," Claire answered patiently, sharing a fond look with Alexander over their coffee cups. Plenty of time to get ready. They had agreed to meet at the school before the recital, giving the families time to get acquainted in a quiet setting before the performance. As they drove through Boston's historic streets, Claire noticed both father and son fidgeting with their clothes, Alexander adjusting his tie, Thomas smoothing his sweater repeatedly. The school was a beautiful old building with wide stone, steps leading to massive wooden doors. As they approached, a man's voice called out, "Alexander?" Claire felt Alexander freeze beside her. Standing at the top of the steps, was a man who could have been Alexander's younger reflection, though his face bore laugh lines instead of worry creases. Beside him stood a girl about Thomas's age, her dark hair tied back with a purple ribbon. James. Alexander breathed, and in that one word was 20 years of regret and hope. Thomas gripped Claire's hand tightly as they climbed the steps. When they reached the top, the two brothers stood facing each other, decades of silence stretching between them. It was Sarah who broke the ice. "You must be Thomas," she said, stepping forward. "Dad says you're learning the same Mozart piece as me. Want to compare notes?" Thomas's face lit up at her casual friendliness. "Do you know the tricky part in the third movement?" "Oh my gosh, yes. Come on, we can practice before the recital." She reached for his hand naturally, then stopped, uncertain. "It's okay," Thomas said, extending his hand. "I can follow you." As the children disappeared into the building, guided by Sarah's mother Susan, the brothers finally found their voices. "You look well," they said simultaneously, then laughed, the sound breaking years of tension. "I'm sorry," Alexander began, but James shook his head. "I know, I got your email. But look at Thomas. You've done well by him, Alex. Better than our parents did with me." "Not well enough," Alexander admitted. "Not until Claire helped us see what we were missing." He gestured to Claire, who had been hanging back, giving the brothers space. James turned to her with a warm smile. "Ah, the miracle worker I've heard so much about. Thomas mentioned you in his Braille letter." "Thomas wrote to you?" Alexander asked, surprised. "Got it yesterday. His Braille is excellent. By the way, better than yours was at his age," James teased. And just like that, they were brothers again. Inside the school auditorium, they found Thomas and Sarah at the piano, heads bent together over the keys as they compared their interpretations of the Mozart piece. Susan, a warm-faced woman with kind eyes, was explaining to Thomas how Sarah used different tactile markers on the sheet music to help with timing. "We should get one of those for home," Thomas called out as he heard them approach, then added hopefully, "I mean, if we really do move to Boston." "Move to Boston?" James asked, his eyebrows rising. Alexander cleared his throat. "We're considering it. The New Hope Center is here, and Thomas could benefit from their programs, and—" He hesitated, then continued, "and family should be closer than a plane ride away." The recital itself was a celebration of young talent. But for the small group, sitting together in the middle row, it was much more. When Sarah took the stage to perform her Mozart piece, Thomas sat forward in his seat, his fingers moving in silent accompaniment. As the familiar notes filled the auditorium, Claire noticed how Alexander and James sat with their shoulders just touching, bridging a gap that had seemed uncrossable just weeks ago. After Sarah's performance, there was a small reception in the school's garden. As the adults chatted, Thomas and Sarah sat on a bench nearby, their heads close together as they discussed music and shared stories about learning Braille. "They look like they've known each other forever," Susan remarked, watching the children. "Sometimes the heart recognizes its own," James said. His unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of the children's laughter. "Speaking of which, Alex, when are you going to admit what's really going on here?" Alexander looked startled. "What do you mean?" "Please," James laughed. "I may be blind, but I can hear it in your voice when you talk about Claire. Some things don't need eyes to see." Claire felt her face warm as Alexander turned to look at her. In the soft autumn light, his expression was more open than she'd ever seen it. Alexander began, but was interrupted by Thomas and Sarah, running up to them. "Can we show you something?" Thomas asked excitedly. "Sarah and I worked out a duet version of the Mozart piece. Well, sort of. We might mess up some parts." "The best music comes from being willing to mess up sometimes," James said, ruffling his daughter's hair. "Right, Alex?" Alexander looked at his brother, then at his son, and finally at Claire. "Right," he said softly. "Sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from being brave enough to risk imperfection." As they all moved back inside to hear the children's improvised duet, Claire felt Alexander's hand slip into hers. Unlike all the accidental touches they'd shared over the past weeks, this one felt deliberate, a choice, a beginning. The music that filled the room wasn't perfect, but it was genuine and joyful, much like the newly formed bonds between two families finding their way back to each other. Outside, the Boston afternoon painted the windows with golden light, promising more beautiful days to come. The return flight to their coastal home felt different somehow, as if the air itself carried the promise of change. Thomas spent most of the journey excitedly planning future piano duets with Sarah, while Alexander made business calls about property listings in Boston's historic districts. "There's a beautiful brownstone near the New Hope Center," he mentioned, during a break between calls. "5 bedrooms, a garden, and..." He paused, glancing at Claire. "Plenty of room for a live-in teacher, if she's interested." Claire felt her heart skip a beat at the implications of his words. Before she could respond, Thomas chimed in enthusiastically, "With a music room? For when Sarah visits?" "Actually," Alexander smiled, "it has space for 2 pianos in the living room. James mentioned he could help us find the right instruments." The mansion, when they finally reached it, seemed different too, less like a fortress and more like a temporary stopping point on their journey. As they walked through the familiar halls, Thomas trailing his fingers along the wall guides, Claire noticed how many things had already changed since her arrival just months ago. The strict schedule board in the kitchen had been replaced by a more flexible weekly planner, written in both regular text and Braille. Thomas's room, once sterile and museum-like, now featured tactile art pieces they'd created together and a growing collection of Braille books. Even Alexander's study door, traditionally closed and imposing, stood open more often than not. That evening, as Claire helped Thomas unpack, he pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "Sarah gave me this," he said, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a handmade bracelet of knotted threads. "She said each knot pattern means something different. She's going to teach me how to make them, too." "That's wonderful," Claire replied, watching as his fingers explored the intricate patterns. "You and Sarah seem to connect right away." "She doesn't treat me like I'm broken," Thomas said quietly. "Neither do you or Father, not anymore." He paused, his hand stilling on the bracelet. "Claire, when we move to Boston, you'll come with us, won't you?" Before Claire could answer, Alexander appeared in the doorway. "That's something I'd like to discuss, actually. Thomas, would you be okay practicing your piano piece for a while? I need to speak with Claire." In Alexander's study, the afternoon light cast long shadows through the open window. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility, so different from the stale, controlled air that had filled this room when Claire first arrived. "I've been thinking," Alexander began, pacing slightly, "about changes, about the future. Moving to Boston isn't just about being closer to James and his family, or about the New Hope Center. It's about building something new, something better." Claire watched him move, noting how his usually perfect posture had relaxed, becoming more natural. "The changes you've already made have been remarkable," she offered. "Because of you," he said, stopping to face her. "You showed us both how to live again, not just exist. You helped me see what I was missing, not just with Thomas, but with everything." He moved closer, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "The position I mentioned, the live-in teacher role, that's not exactly what I'm proposing." Claire's breath caught as he took her hand. "What are you proposing?" "Partnership," he said softly. "In every sense. I know it's unconventional. You came here as Thomas's teacher and I was your employer. But somewhere between Braille lessons and broken water pitchers, between Boston plans and brother reunions, something changed. I changed. We all did." Outside the study, they heard the gentle notes of Thomas's piano practice, the melody more confident and expressive than ever before. "I love him, you know," Claire said quietly. "I've tried to maintain professional distance, but love doesn't work that way," Alexander finished. "I know. I've watched you with him, seen how you've helped him bloom, seen how you've helped. I may remember how to be a father instead of just a guardian, and somewhere along the way, we became a family," Claire completed, squeezing his hand. Alexander nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "So I'm asking, Claire Bennett, would you consider making it official? Not just as Thomas's teacher, not just as my wife, but as a full partner in whatever we build next. The piano music swelled in the background, as if providing a soundtrack to the moment. Before Claire could respond, they heard Thomas call out, "Say yes, Claire. I've been hoping you would." They turned to find him standing in the doorway, grinning broadly. "I may be blind," he said, "but I'm not blind to everything. You both sound different when you're together. Happier." Claire looked at Thomas, then back at Alexander, seeing in both their faces the same hope, the same love. The answer was as clear as the melody still hanging in the air. The news of Claire and Alexander's engagement spread quickly, bringing with it a whirlwind of reactions. James and Susan were delighted, immediately offering to help with Boston housing recommendations. Sarah sent Thomas another friendship bracelet, this one with a pattern she said meant family. Victoria Peterson's response came in the form of a tersely worded email, expressing her disappointment in Alexander's continued descent into sentimentality. Alexander read it once, then closed his laptop with a small smile. "Mother never did understand that some forms of strength come from opening your heart, not closing it," he remarked to Claire as they walked along the beach one evening. Thomas was ahead of them, practicing with his new mobility cane, his movements becoming more confident each day. The autumn weeks flew by in a blur of preparations. The Boston brownstone proved to be everything they'd hoped for, its historic charm perfectly balanced with modern amenities. James helped them find an antique piano that matched Sarah's, ensuring the cousins could practice their duets properly. At the New Hope Center, Thomas's initial assessment had gone better than anyone expected. "He has remarkable spatial awareness," the director had noted, "and his musical ability could be a wonderful bridge to other skills." Now, as they packed up the mansion that had been both haven and prison, each box represented a step toward their new life. Thomas insisted on helping, his fingers carefully labeling each container in Braille alongside Claire's written descriptions. "Look what I found," he called out one afternoon, his hands cradling a dusty photo album. It was behind Father's old books in the library. Claire and Alexander joined him on the floor as he opened the album, its pages crackling with age. Alexander inhaled sharply at the first photograph. Two young boys at a piano, their faces bright with laughter. "That's Father and Uncle James," Thomas said, his fingers tracing the edges of the photo. "Mrs. Sullivan showed me this one before. She said it was taken the day Uncle James mastered his first Chopin piece." Alexander's voice was thick with emotion as he described the scene to his son. He played it perfectly, even though everyone said it was too advanced for his age. Mother was hosting one of her charity luncheons, but James's music was so beautiful that all her guests stopped talking just to listen. "Was she proud?" Thomas asked quietly. "For a moment," Alexander admitted. "But then she worried about what people would think. A blind boy performing at a society event. She never let him play at another gathering after that." Claire watched as Thomas processed this information, his expression thoughtful. "But we're different now, aren't we? Sarah and I are going to play duets at the New Hope Center's holiday concert." "Yes," Alexander smiled, pulling his son close. "We're very different now." Later that evening, as Thomas practiced his part of the duet, Claire found Alexander in his study, sorting through the last of his papers. The room that had once been his fortress of solitude now stood half empty, its remaining contents bathed in the warm light of sunset. "Having second thoughts?" "Second," she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "About leaving?" "No." He turned to her, his eyes soft. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since you arrived. This room used to feel like the only place I could breathe. Now it feels too small, too closed off from everything that matters." Claire stepped into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let go of the walls we built to protect ourselves." "I was so afraid," he confessed quietly. "After the accident, after losing Catherine, I thought if I could just control everything, keep Thomas safe in this perfect bubble, nothing else bad could happen. I never realized I was just continuing what my mother did with James." "But you broke the cycle," Claire reminded him. "You chose love over fear." Their moment was interrupted by Thomas calling from the music room. "Father, Claire, come listen." To this part, Sarah and I figured out how to synchronize it over video chat. They found Thomas beaming at the piano, his laptop open beside him with Sarah's face on the screen. The two children had been practicing together daily, their determination to perfect their duet bringing them closer despite the distance. "Next week we'll be able to practice in person," Sarah said excitedly. "Dad's already planning to tune both. Pianos exactly the same way." As they listened to the cousins play, their music weaving together across the miles, Claire felt Alexander's arms slip around her waist. In just a few days, they would leave this mansion by the sea, taking with them the memories worth keeping and leaving behind the fears that had kept them trapped. The moving trucks would arrive on Monday. The New Hope Center had already set up Thomas's schedule for integration into their programs. James and Susan were preparing the guest room for their first weekend visit. All the pieces were falling into place, like notes in a well-composed symphony. That night, as they sat together on the beach for one of their last sunset picnics, Thomas asked Claire to read from Treasure Island, the book that had started their journey toward each other. As her fingers moved over the Braille dots alongside his, Alexander's hand joined theirs, 3 sets of fingers sharing the story together, just as they would share whatever adventures lay ahead. The Boston brownstone came alive with the sound of piano music on moving day. James had arranged for both pianos to be delivered and tuned first, turning what could have been a chaotic experience into a celebration. Thomas and Sarah sat side by side on the piano bench, their fingers dancing over the keys while the moving crew worked around them. "This room has perfect acoustics," James remarked, his head tilted as he listened to the children play. "The original hardwood floors and high ceilings create natural resonance." Claire watched Alexander's face as he took in the scene, his son and niece playing together, his brother offering expert advice, the sunlight streaming through tall windows that faced the street rather than the isolated ocean. The rigid businessman she'd first met months ago had been replaced by someone who smiled more easily, laughed more freely. "The garden needs work," Susan said, leading Claire through the French doors at the back of the house. "But I'm thinking we could create a sensory space here. Plants with different textures and scents, wind chimes, maybe a small fountain." "Thomas would love that," Claire agreed, already imagining summer afternoons spent exploring the garden together. "And it would be perfect for the New Hope Center students when they visit." Alexander had thrown himself into the foundation work with unexpected passion, transforming the Peterson Family Foundation's mission to focus on arts education for visually impaired children. The brownstone's 3rd floor was being converted into a small music school, where James would offer piano lessons alongside other instructors. "Claire," Thomas called from inside, "come hear what Sarah and I discovered. If we play these chords together, it makes a whole new sound." As Claire turned to go back inside, she caught Alexander watching her with a soft expression. "What?" she asked, feeling her cheeks warm. "Just thinking about the first time I saw you with him," he replied, taking her hand. "How natural you were, how you saw past all the walls we'd built. I was terrified of that, you know." Inside, the moving crew was efficiently placing furniture according to the carefully planned layout designed to help Thomas navigate his new home. Each room had been thoughtfully arranged with tactile markers and clear paths, but unlike the mansion's rigid systems, these were integrated naturally into the home's warm, welcoming atmosphere. "Mr. Peterson," called one of the movers, "where would you like this photo album?" Alexander took the familiar leather-bound book, his fingers tracing its worn edges. "Thomas," he called, "would you help me decide where to put the family photos?" The piano music paused as Thomas made his way confidently to his father's voice, one hand trailing along the guide rail that had been elegantly incorporated into the wall's design. "Could we put them where everyone can see them?" he asked, "and maybe get some of them made with raised edges so I can feel them too?" "Already taken care of," James announced, producing a flat package from behind his back. "Wedding present. Came early? It's a special process that creates tactile versions of photographs. Sarah helped me pick the best ones." As they opened the package together, Claire watched 3 generations of Petersons, past, present, and future, trace the contours of their shared history. Thomas's fingers moved over the raised image of his mother's face, while Alexander and James rediscovered childhood moments preserved in touchable form. The afternoon light shifted, casting warm shadows through the new house's many windows. Outside, the sounds of Boston life created a lively backdrop. Children playing in the park across the street, the distant toll of church bells, the gentle rustling of autumn leaves. "It's so different from the mansion," Thomas observed, his head tilted as he listened, but a good different, like the opposite of being alone. Sarah, who had been quietly exploring the house, came running back into the room. "Thomas, wait until you feel what I found. There's a window seat in the library that's perfect for reading. And guess what? Mom helped me put up some of those tactile constellations we were talking about on the ceiling above it." As the children hurried off to explore, Claire felt Alexander's arms slip around her waist from behind. "Having second thoughts about joining this chaos," he murmured in her ear. She leaned back against him, watching as James and Susan began unpacking boxes marked kitchen while discussing plans for family dinners. Through the open windows came the sound of leaves crunching under feet and distant laughter. The whole house seemed to breathe with life and possibility. "Actually," she replied, turning in his arms, "I was thinking this is exactly where I belong." Later that evening, after the moving crew had left and initial order had been restored, they all gathered in the living room. The two pianos stood like sentinels in the corner, their polished surfaces reflecting the warm lamplight. James and Susan had stayed to help, turning the first night in the new house into an impromptu family dinner. Thomas and Sarah performed their duet, the music flowing naturally between them as if they'd been playing together all their lives. In the middle of the piece, Thomas paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. "Nothing," Thomas smiled. "I just want to remember this moment, how it feels to be here, with everyone, making music together." Claire felt Alexander's hand find hers in the gathering darkness, and she squeezed it gently. Outside their windows, Boston prepared for night, but inside their new home, everything felt bright with promise and possibility. The first weeks in Boston brought a whirlwind of changes, each day filled with new experiences and adjustments. Thomas threw himself into his programs at the New Hope Center with characteristic determination, while Alexander managed his company remotely, transforming his home office into a space that welcomed family interruptions rather than shutting them out. Claire found herself navigating her own transition, balancing her role as Thomas's teacher with her evolving place in the family. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light at unexpected moments, reminding her of how far they'd all come from those first tense days at the mansion. One morning, as she helped Thomas prepare for his first group class at the center, she noticed him paying extra attention to his clothing choices. "The blue sweater," he said decisively, running, his fingers over the Braille label they'd sewn inside. "Sarah says blue brings out my eyes." "Nervous about meeting new friends?" Claire asked gently. "A little," Thomas admitted, "but excited too. Sarah says there's a boy in her class who's learning both piano and violin. She thinks we'd get along." The key. New Hope Center had turned out to be everything they'd hoped for and more. The director, Dr. Martinez, had immediately recognized Thomas's potential and created a program that challenged him while providing the support he needed. "He's not just learning skills," Dr. Martinez told Claire and Alexander during their weekly progress meeting. "He's discovering who he is beyond his visual impairment. The music program especially seems to be opening new doors for him." Indeed, Thomas's piano playing had evolved remarkably since they'd moved. The rigid perfection of his previous practice sessions had been replaced by something more experimental, more joyful. James, who came over several times a week to work with both Thomas and Sarah, noted the change with pride. "He's not just playing the notes anymore," James observed one afternoon as the children practiced their latest duet. "He's feeling the music, letting it speak through him. That's something that can't be taught. It has to come from within." The brownstone itself seemed to adapt to its new inhabitants, its spaces filling with warmth and purpose. The garden Susan had envisioned was taking shape, with raised beds of herbs that released their scents when touched, and wind chimes that created different melodies depending on the breeze. Even Victoria's resistance showed signs of softening. Her weekly calls to Alexander, once filled with criticism and dire predictions, had gradually shifted to cautious inquiries about Thomas's progress. When she learned about his successful performance at the center's autumn showcase, she sent a brief but significant message. Perhaps I was hasty in my judgment. One Saturday morning, as Claire and Alexander sat in their new breakfast nook watching Thomas and Sarah practice in the garden, they heard an unexpected sound: laughter. Real, uninhibited laughter from Thomas as Sarah described a butterfly that had landed on the wind chime. "I never thought I'd hear that sound again," Alexander said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "After the accident, I was so focused on protecting him that I forgot about letting him live." Claire squeezed his hand. "You found your way back to each other. That's what matters." Their conversation was interrupted by James and Susan arriving for their regular weekend visit, carrying bags of groceries for their traditional family dinner. As James made his way to the piano to check its tuning, he paused to listen to the children's laughter floating in from the garden. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Mother would hate everything about this. The noise, the chaos, the way we're all tangled up in each other's lives, but I think that's exactly why it works." That evening, as they all gathered around the dining table, Claire looked at the faces illuminated by candlelight. Alexander, relaxed and smiling as he discussed plans for the foundation's first fundraiser. James and Susan, their hands clasped casually on the table as they shared stories from their week. Thomas and Sarah, heads bent together as they planned their next musical adventure. "We should invite Grandmother for Christmas," Thomas said suddenly, causing a momentary hush around the table. "I want her to hear how Sarah and I play together now, and—" He paused, his fingers finding the raised pattern of Sarah's friendship bracelet on his wrist. "And maybe she needs to learn about different kinds of strength, too." Alexander reached across the table to take his son's hand. "I think that's a wonderful idea. What do you think, James?" James was quiet for a moment, his unseeing eyes turned toward the window, where the evening breeze carried the sound of their garden wind chimes. "Yes," he said finally. "It's time to complete the circle. After all, that's what family does. We keep trying, keep growing, keep finding our way back to each other." As if to emphasize his words, the wind chimes played a gentle melody, mixing with the city sounds and the warm conversation around the table. Claire looked at her engagement ring again, seeing in its sparkle a reflection of all the light that had come into their lives. Not despite the challenges they'd faced, but because of how they'd faced them together. The first snow of December transformed Boston into a wonderland of new sensations. Thomas stood on the brownstone's front steps, his face tilted upward as snowflakes landed on his cheeks. "They each feel different," he marveled, "just like Uncle James said they would." The holiday season had brought a festive energy to their new home. Claire and Susan had spent weekends helping the children create tactile decorations, pine cone wreaths, ribbon garlands with different textures, and strings of bells that chimed softly throughout the house. "Victoria confirmed she's coming," Alexander announced one evening as they sat in the living room, the scent of cinnamon and pine needles filling the air. "She'll be here for Christmas Eve, in time for the children's performance at the center." Claire felt Thomas tense slightly, beside her on the couch where they had been reading a Braille version of A Christmas Carol. "Will she like it?" he asked quietly. "Our new home, the way we live now?" "She'll see how happy you are," Claire assured him, though she felt her own flutter of nervousness at the prospect of Victoria's visit. The last time they'd seen Alexander's mother, she had been storming out of the mansion, vowing never to accept their sentimental choices. The next few days were filled with preparations. The brownstone, already warm and welcoming, took on an extra layer of festivity. Sarah and Thomas spent hours practicing their Christmas duet, determined to make it perfect. James came over daily to help them refine their performance, his gentle guidance bringing out the best in both children. "Listen to how the notes weave together," he explained, standing between the two pianos. "It's like a conversation in music. You're not just playing the same piece, you're talking to each other through it." One afternoon, while the children were at the center, Alexander found Claire in their bedroom, wrapping presents with Braille gift tags. "Mother called again," he said, sitting beside her on the bed. "She asked what Thomas likes to read now. I think she's trying in her own way." Claire leaned against him, remembering the rigid woman who had once declared that emotional attachments were a sign of weakness. "People can surprise us," she said softly. "Look how far we've all come." The day before Victoria's arrival, an unexpected package came from the mansion's caretaker. Inside, they found a carefully preserved music box that had belonged to Catherine. "Thomas used to fall asleep to this," Alexander explained, his voice thick with emotion as he wound it up. The gentle melody filled the room, and Thomas's hands stilled on his piano keys. "I remember," he whispered. "Mother would play it every night, and sometimes she'd make up stories to go with the music." Later that evening, as snow fell softly outside, the family gathered in the living room for their now traditional story time. The music box sat on the coffee table, its tune mixing with the sound of Claire and Thomas's fingers moving over Braille pages as they read together. "I've been thinking," Thomas said during a pause in the reading, "about what to say to grandmother. When she comes, I want her to understand that being different isn't being weak, that finding new ways to do things isn't giving up." Alexander wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. "When did you get so wise?" "I had good teachers," Thomas smiled, reaching for both Claire and his father's hands. "All of you showed me that strength comes in many forms." The next morning brought final preparations for Victoria's arrival. Sarah came over early, bringing a special gift she and Thomas had been working on, a tactile family tree, with photographs raised like the ones James had given them, and descriptions in both print and Braille. "We put everyone on it," Sarah explained excitedly. "Even great-uncle James when he was little, playing piano with Dad. And look, we left space here for new additions." As they hung the family tree in the entryway, Claire caught Alexander watching her with a tender expression. In just a few months they would be married, officially making permanent what their hearts had already decided. The sound of a car pulling up outside made them all pause. Thomas straightened his sweater, the blue one that Sarah liked, and took a deep breath. Through the window they could see Victoria Peterson emerging from her town car, elegant as ever in her winter coat, but something about her posture seemed less rigid, less certain. "Ready?" Claire asked, squeezing Thomas's hand. He nodded, his face set with determination. "Ready? It's time to show grandmother that some changes make us stronger, not weaker." As they moved toward the front door, the music box's melody drifted through the house, its sweet notes carrying memories of the past and promises of the future. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating Boston in a blanket of white that made everything feel fresh and new, ready for whatever transformations lay ahead. Victoria Peterson's entrance into the brownstone was met with a moment of profound silence. Her eyes swept the entryway, taking in the tactile decorations, the sound of wind chimes from the garden, and finally, the family tree displayed prominently on the wall. "You've been busy," she said, her voice carefully neutral, as she removed her gloves. Then, catching sight of the raised photographs, she moved closer to examine them. Is that the Christmas when James played his first concert?" "Yes," James's voice came from the doorway to the living room. "December 18th, 1982. You wore your blue silk dress, and Father gave me his lucky cufflinks." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she touched the photograph. "You remember that?" "I remember everything, Mother, the good and the difficult, just like Thomas remembers. Memory isn't just what we see. It's what we feel, what we hear, what we carry in our hearts." The tension in the entryway was broken by Sarah bounding down the stairs. "Grandmother, come see what Thomas and I have been practicing. We're playing at the center's concert tomorrow, but we can give you a preview." Before Victoria could object, she was being led to the living room where the two pianos waited. Thomas sat at one, his posture confident as his fingers found the keys. Sarah took her place at the other, and with a shared nod they began to play. The piece started softly, a Christmas carol arranged as a duet, but with something more. As the music filled the room, Claire watched Victoria's face. The older woman's composed expression began to crack as she recognized the underlying melody weaving through the carol, the same tune from Catherine's music box. "We added it in," Thomas explained during a natural pause. "Sarah plays the carol and I weave in Mother's lullaby. Then we switch. It's like having past and present playing together." Victoria sank into a nearby chair, her usual poise wavering. "When did you become so accomplished?" "He always was. Mother," Alexander said quietly, "we just had to learn to listen differently." He gestured around the warm, lived-in room with its holiday decorations and family photographs. "All of this, it's not weakness or sentimentality. It's strength, the kind that comes from letting love in instead of shutting it out." As if to emphasize his point, the wind chimes in the garden caught a winter breeze, adding their voice to the moment. Victoria turned toward the sound, then back to the room's occupants, seeing them perhaps for the first time. Not as failures of her rigid standards, but as a family that had found its own way to thrive. "The concert tomorrow," she said finally. "What time should I arrive?" The evening that followed was unlike any the Petersons had ever experienced with Victoria present. She listened as Thomas and Sarah excitedly described their activities at the center, asked James questions about his piano tuning business, and even allowed Susan to serve her tea in a mismatched cup that Sarah had picked out especially for her. Later, as the children practiced one final time, Victoria found herself alone with Claire in the kitchen. "You've changed them," she said abruptly. "All of them." "They changed themselves," Claire replied gently. "They just needed to know it was safe to do so." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the pattern on her teacup. "When James was born blind, I thought the only way to protect him was to make him stronger than his disability. I did the same with Alexander after his father passed, and then tried to do it with Thomas. I never considered—" She paused, looking through the doorway where her grandsons played together, their music filling the house with joy. "I never considered that there might be different kinds of strength." The next morning brought the excitement of the center's Christmas concert. The auditorium was filled with families, the air buzzing with anticipation. Victoria sat between Alexander and James, her usual perfect posture softened somewhat as she watched Thomas and Sarah take their places at the twin pianos on stage. As the children began to play, their duet rising clear and beautiful in the winter morning light, Claire saw tears glisten in Victoria's eyes. The melody of Catherine's lullaby wove through the Christmas carol like a golden thread through a tapestry, connecting past and present, loss and love, endings and beginnings. Alexander reached for Claire's hand, and she felt the warmth of his touch echo the warmth in her heart. Beside them, Victoria Peterson, the woman who had once banished a son for being different, wiped her eyes with an elegant handkerchief and whispered, "Beautiful. They're both so beautiful." After the applause faded and the families began to mingle, Thomas made his way unerringly to his grandmother's side. "Did you like it?" he asked, his face glowing with the joy of performance. Victoria reached out and, for the first time in years, drew him into an embrace. "My darling boy," she said softly, "I didn't just like it. I finally heard it. The music that's been playing all along while I was too afraid to listen." Spring arrived in Boston with a burst of new life, bringing with it the scent of flowering trees and the promise of new beginnings. The garden behind the brownstone had transformed under Susan's careful guidance into a sensory paradise, with raised beds of fragrant herbs and flowers that Thomas could identify by touch and smell. The morning of Claire and Alexander's wedding dawned clear and bright. The ceremony would be held in the garden, an intimate celebration that reflected the way their family had grown together. Thomas and Sarah had been practicing a special piece for months, a duet they'd composed themselves, with help from James. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked Claire as he sat with her in the library, his fingers moving over the Braille sheet music one last time. "A little," she admitted, smoothing her simple white dress. "But a good kind of nervous, like before a performance that you know is going to be wonderful." "That's how I felt before the Christmas concert," Thomas nodded sagely, But then grandmother surprised us all by crying, and suddenly it wasn't scary anymore. Victoria had indeed surprised them all in the months following Christmas. She'd begun taking Braille lessons herself, determined to read the stories her grandsons loved so much. She'd even joined the board of the Peterson Family Foundation, bringing her formidable organizational skills to their mission of supporting arts education for visually impaired children. The sound of Sarah practicing drifted up from the garden, where the final preparations were being made. The guest list was small but significant: James and Susan, Victoria, the staff and students from the New Hope Center, and a few close friends who had supported their journey. "Claire?" Alexander's voice came from the doorway. "Could I have a moment?" Thomas grinned knowingly. "That's my cue to go find Sarah. We need to warm up anyway." He navigated confidently through the room, pausing at the door. "Dad, you're not supposed to see the bride before the wedding." "I think we've never been ones for following the usual rules," Alexander chuckled, stepping aside to let his son pass. Once they were alone, Alexander crossed to where Claire sat. "I have something for you," he said softly. It belonged to Catherine. He placed a small velvet box in her hands. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with tiny musical notes engraved along its length. "She wore it the day we were married," Alexander explained. "She said music was love, made audible. I think she would have been so happy to see how that's become true for our family." Claire felt tears welling in her eyes as Alexander fastened the bracelet around her wrist. "Thank you,"